governments do have a deficit problem, and lots of them don't, by the way. There's no deficit problem for any level of government in Canada right now, any meaningful sense that they're going to go bankrupt. That's just nonsense. But it is a convenient ideology. And we also need to remind ourselves that even if there is a deficit problem in some countries, there's a very easy fix that has nothing to do with, a couple easy fixes actually, that have nothing to do with cutting social services. One is, this is what I would favor for Greece, you repudiate the debt. You simply say, this debt was acquired to bail out banks, and we as a population are taking no responsibility for it. Simple. Okay? And I believe that's what Greece should do. By the way, Argentina did do that in 2001 too, when it was in a very severe crisis. And you may have noticed Argentina didn't fall off the map. Okay? It still exists. All right? So it's a genuine option. But then there's another option, of course, which is to tax the wealthy to pay for it. They were the ones whose institutions created the crisis that needed the bailouts. They should pay. I'll give you just one statistic that really illustrates the point. The federal government has a $67 billion deficit. Okay? Actually, it's not huge in the overall scheme of things. If you put corporate taxes and taxes on the wealthy back to where they were, the rate that they had in 1980, that deficit would disappear. Just move the tax rates right back to where they were in 1980. No deficit. Okay? So we need to be very clear. It's politically constructed, this deficit. And there are all kinds of options other than austerity. Another point I want to make in the Canadian case is that our finance minister, Mr. Flaherty, goes around saying all the time, we had no bank bailout in Canada. That's false. This is completely and totally false. There were a whole series of tens and hundreds of billions of dollars strong programs that were used to bail out Canada's banks in 2008 and 9. And if you want to find really nice, accessible piece on it, the good radical economist Ellen Russell wrote a piece on Rabbit called Occupy Bailouts in November. Just Google Occupy Bailout. It's a really nice piece there by Ellen Russell that just takes us through what was actually done. The one thing she leaves out, which we also need to remind ourselves, is that the Canadian government didn't just bail out its banks, although it did bail out Canadian banks, it also bailed out Chrysler and General Motors, two large global manufacturing corporations. Ellen's article doesn't touch on that, so when you read her article about the banks, also factor in GM and Chrysler as part of the Canadian story. So that's the sort of overall picture. The next level of it, of course, is to realize that austerity pushes economies back into recession. That's the other part of it. In addition to punishing people who did not cause the crisis, we even heard from Mervyn King, it also pushes the economy back towards recession. And the reason is really basic. If you start laying off large numbers of public sector employees, if you start cutting people's wages in half, and that's at the electromotive plant where we were just having the protest in London earlier today, where the wages have been cut in half. You cut people's wages in half or you lay them off, okay? They cannot continue to purchase goods and services at the same level they used to. That means that the demand drops, whether it's the local restaurant they patronized, whether it's other goods and services they used, and so the economy starts to slide back down because consumer spending starts to slide back down. Just again, think about Britain for a moment. Britain's austerity program involves the national government laying off 400,000 people over the next 4 years. Okay? 400,000 will lose their jobs. That's their austerity plan. Well, you take the spending by 400,000 gainfully employed people out of the economy, what do you expect? So the countries that have had the most really aggressive austerity are massively in recession right now. The Greek economy shrunk by nearly 7% last year. Well, of course it did. Portugal and Spain contracted. Britain contracted. Ireland contracted. At the end of last year, wealthy Germany contracted ever so slightly in the last quarter. Because that's what austerity does. By reducing people's incomes, it reduces the amount they can buy in goods and services, and so the whole economy starts to turn down into recession again. And what we know is that the demographic group which is most paying the price for this is youth. I mean, take Spain. Spain's official unemployment rate has just about hit 25%. That's Great Depression levels. But the youth unemployment rate is now officially 50%. Okay? 1 out of every 2 young people in the labor market looking for work cannot find work. Greece is heading in that direction. Ireland has gone from about a 4.5% unemployment rate prior to the crisis to almost 15% now. So this is what's been happening. And it's really vital that in all the work that we're doing, we are bringing it back over and over again to the banking collapse and the bailout as the fundamental root causes, and then talking about the ways in which this tells us about the economic system in which we live. Because what we're being told is that the losses are going to be the public's responsibility. Or put simply, profits are private, losses are public. When they make profits, those institutions, there's no talk of sharing that wealth. But when they make losses, it's, oh yeah, we're going to pay for them. The public sector is going to bail them out. And so that's, as I say, really vital. Now, I want to come to the second part of the Mervyn King quote. He says, he's surprised the degree of public anger hasn't been greater than it has. And I said to you a few minutes ago, well, part of that has been the success of the mainstream media and politicians in essentially creating a fictional narrative, a story according to which we all live beyond our means and now we have to tighten our belts, and which just tries to obliterate our memories of 2008 and 9 when banks were collapsing and being bailed out right, left, and center. And that's that's clearly a part of the story. But I also want to emphasize that we don't want to overstate how successful that story has been. Put really simply, Occupy would not have had the great resonance with the public that it had unless there were a lot of people fundamentally skeptical of that story. I mean, I think many of you know that for the first 10 days, the U.S. media just ignored Occupy Wall Street. And then they had a moment, which they love, a moment of confrontation on the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, now they had a story, they were going to run with it, and they thought it was going to play back against the occupiers. In fact, as you know, it ended up playing back against the mayor, the police, and so on. But once, at that point, Occupy Wall Street broke through into public coverage in the mass media, it was amazing the way the message took off. I mean, I couldn't believe it that a week after the battle on Brooklyn Bridge, the opinion polls in the U.S. were telling us that Occupy Wall Street was twice as popular as the Tea Party. Now, last time I looked, Occupy did not have any deep pockets, but I guarantee you the Tea Party does. They have some very deep pockets to buy media time, politicians, and so on. So to imagine that in the space of 3 weeks, Occupy was twice as popular, that tells you that there is still, despite the working overtime by the media, there's a lot of openness to the kind of discussion we're having, that Occupy has been putting across in terms of its message and so on. The other thing I would say is that Mervyn King misses something when he says he's surprised the degree of public anger hasn't been greater. What he misses is that people did try to resist a lot. It's just, I'll put it in these terms, they tried the old style methods of resistance, and they weren't equal to the task. I'll give you a couple of examples.